International Criminal Court, ICC, has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and Hamas military leader, Mohammed Deif, who was killed by Israel on July 13, 2024. This unprecedented decision, announced on November 21, 2024, follows allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, linked to the ongoing conflict in Gaza. The ICC's pre-trial chamber found reasonable grounds to believe that these individuals bear criminal responsibility for actions taken during the conflict, particularly from October 8, 2023, to May 20, 2024. The ICC alleges that both Netanyahu and Gallant deliberately and knowingly denied the civilian population in Gaza access to essential resources for survival, including food, water, and medical supplies. This has contributed to widespread suffering among civilians in Gaza during Israel's military operations. Netanyahu's office condemned the warrants as anti-Semitic, likening them to historical injustices faced by Jews. Netanyahu also asserted that Israel had provided substantial humanitarian aid to Gaza and would not be deterred from its military objectives. Hamas welcomed the warrants, viewing them as a historic step towards justice for Palestinians. They called for global support to enforce these warrants against Israeli leaders. President Joe Biden criticized the ICC's decision as outrageous, emphasizing that there is no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. This is hardly surprising, given America's unconditional support of Israel. The same Joe Biden welcomed the similar arrest that the ICC issued for President Putin. EU officials have indicated that member states are obligated to respect the ICC's ruling, which could lead to potential arrests if Netanyahu or Gallant travel to any of these countries. However, Viktor Orban of Hungary has condemned the ICC and has vowed support for Netanyahu and Israel. Countries like France and Italy have stated they would comply with ICC statutes regarding the arrest warrants, but have not confirmed specific actions. The UK government has refrained from commenting on whether it would arrest Netanyahu if he entered British territory. President Trump has yet to make an official statement on this matter, but his administration's approach is expected to condemn the ICC and support Netanyahu. Trump's incoming national security advisor, Representative Mike Waltz, publicly dismissed the ICC as lacking credibility, asserting that the allegations against Netanyahu and Gallant have been refuted by the U.S. government. He emphasized that Israel has acted lawfully in defending itself against what he termed genocidal terrorists, and promised a strong response to what he described as the ICC's anti-Semitic bias, when the Trump administration takes office in January 2025. Senator Lindsey Graham echoed Waltz's sentiments, warning that failure to act against the ICC's decision would be a significant mistake. He proposed legislation aimed at imposing consequences on countries that cooperate with the ICC regarding these warrants, framing it as a defense of U.S. sovereignty, and an assertion that the ICC lacks jurisdiction over non-member states like Israel and the U.S. Other Republican lawmakers also expressed outrage at the ICC's actions. Senator Tim Scott criticized the court as an anti-Israel propaganda machine, while Jim Risch called the warrants a complete disgrace, and suggested moving forward with sanctions against the ICC. The United States has a complex history of responding to actions taken by the International Criminal Court, characterized by periods of both hostility and engagements. In 2002, shortly after the ICC's establishment, the U.S. Congress passed the American Service-Members Protection Act, ASPA, commonly called the Hague Invasion Act, which restricted U.S. government support for the ICC, and authorized the use of military force to free U.S. personnel detained by the court. This act was invoked by Senator Tom Cotton, on November 22, 2024, to threaten the ICC. The implication being that America regards Netanyahu as a U.S. citizen, who can be rescued by the U.S. military. In other words, the U.S. will protect even criminals by brute force. This act reflects a strong stance against ICC jurisdiction over U.S. citizens and aimed to prevent countries from cooperating with the ICC without U.S. consent. At that time, the Bush administration pressured other countries to sign bilateral immunity agreements, Article 98 agreements, that would exempt U.S. nationals from ICC jurisdiction, threatening to cut off military aid to those that refused. In 2005, there was a notable shift as the Bush administration began to support some ICC actions, particularly regarding investigations into atrocities in Darfur, Sudan. The U.S. abstained from vetoing a UN Security Council resolution that referred the situation in Darfur to the ICC, indicating a willingness to cooperate under specific circumstances. The Obama administration marked a significant pivot towards cooperation with the ICC. It sought to engage more positively with the court, participating in its meetings and supporting its investigations into war crimes in various contexts, including the Sudan and Libya. This period saw the U.S. acting as an observer at ICC meetings, and expressing intent to support international justice mechanisms more broadly. Under President Trump, U.S. and ICC relations deteriorated sharply again. In 2018, National Security Advisor John Bolton declared that the U.S. would not cooperate with the ICC, and threatened sanctions against its officials, if they pursued investigations involving U.S. citizens or allies. In 2020, Trump issued an executive order, imposing sanctions on ICC officials involved in investigations against Americans, reinforcing a confrontational stance towards the court. On September 2, 2020, the Trump administration sanctioned ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda and Fakiso Mochichoko, head of the Office of the Prosecutor's Jurisdiction, Complementarity, and Cooperation Division. This action was taken under Executive Order 13928, which authorized asset freezes and entry bans against those involved in ICC investigations into U.S. personnel. The sanctions created a chilling effect on the ICC's operations. While the ICC itself was not directly sanctioned, the fear of repercussions led many service providers and financial institutions to reconsider their relationships with the court. This apprehension extended to NGOs, consultants, and lawyers working with the ICC, potentially limiting their ability to collaborate effectively. Following President Biden's inauguration, Executive Order 13928 was revoked on April 1, 2021. This action marked a significant shift in U.S. policy towards the ICC, indicating a potential return to more cooperative engagement with international judicial mechanisms. The sanctions underscored a broader narrative of American exceptionalism and resistance to international legal accountability, particularly regarding actions taken by U.S. military and intelligence personnel abroad. They also highlighted tensions between national sovereignty claims and international human rights obligations. What do the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant mean? The warrants mean that Netanyahu and Gallant are now considered wanted individuals in over 120 countries that are parties to the Rome Statute, which governs the ICC. If they enter these jurisdictions, those countries are legally obligated to arrest them. Despite the legal standing of these warrants, the ICC lacks its own enforcement mechanisms. It relies on member states to execute arrests. This has raised questions about whether Netanyahu or Gallant would actually face arrest, particularly since both Israel and the United States are not members of the ICC and thus not bound by its rulings. However, these arrest warrants are poised to significantly impact Israel's international relations. The warrants compel Israel's allies, particularly in Europe, to reassess their support for Israel. Countries that are ICC member states, such as France, Italy, and the Netherlands, have indicated they would be obligated to arrest Netanyahu and Gallant if they entered their territories. This creates a diplomatic dilemma for these nations, as they balance their support for Israel with adherence to international law and human rights commitments. The warrants may lead Western nations to reconsider arms sales to Israel. Countries supplying military aid will need to deliberate on the implications of supporting a government accused of war crimes. This could result in stricter limitations on arms exports, as nations might be wary of complicity in alleged crimes against humanity. While some countries like Hungary have pledged not to enforce the warrants and continue supporting Israel, others are aligning with the ICC's stance. This division among allies could lead to a more fragmented approach in international relations concerning Israel, thus affecting its diplomatic leverage. Israel heavily depends on the goodwill of Europe and the United States. The ICC's decision places Israel under greater scrutiny regarding its military actions in Gaza. As the allegations include severe humanitarian violations, countries supporting Israel will face increased pressure from their own populations to justify their military aid and political backing. The warrants will hinder Netanyahu's ability to engage in international diplomacy effectively. His potential exposure to arrest may limit his travel options and participation in global forums, isolating him further on the world stage. The ICC's actions will also significantly alter the narrative around Israel's military operations in Gaza, framing them within the context of accountability for war crimes, rather than the previous narrative of self-defense. Some countries in the Global South have expressed support for the ICC's actions, viewing them as a necessary step towards justice for Palestinians. More crucially, these warrants are a wholesale condemnation of the United States, which has long been complicit in the genocide of the Palestinians. Perhaps these warrants may allow the United States to decouple itself from a genocidal state, so that the American people can win back their sovereignty, and not have their fate be tied up with that of Israel. The ICC's arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant represent a pivotal moment that will redefine Israel's international relations landscape. How many nations will continue wanting to be associated with this genocidal state? And how long will the United States want to protect it?